Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. Who's fighting whom in Syria as both Russia and America increase their firepower in the proxy war?
We lose 90 people a day from gun violence. This has gone on too long, and it's time the entire country stood up against the NRA.
The first Democrat debate gets tough on guns as well as Syria and Wall Street. First, is the war in the Middle East really against Islamic State? Or is it a battle between the United States and Russia? Both sides are each fueling the conflict with more firepower, but at the expense of safety and common sense. Earlier this week, combat aircraft from Russia and America came close, very close, to a collision. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the former US ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. He's now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. As usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson is standing by in New York, and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington, D.C. Jeffrey, do you fear there's going to be some hideous accident over in Syria?
I think it's inevitable. You know, you go back to George Washington's farewell address, and he warned the country to avoid entangling alliances. If only we had heeded that throughout our history, and no more so than now.
And Armstrong, the Americans and the Russians yet again seem to be facing off in another part of the world. Is this right?
You know, you've got to understand that Russia has appeared to be weak, and Vladimir Putin is looking for relevance. And Vladimir Putin's agenda is not dismantling ISIS from Syria. His agenda is to push ISIS into Iraq, to force ISIS into places like Erbil and Kirkuk, where they can take over where the oil and their money sources are. It is to push the Free Syrian Army all the way to the north and the northwest to build a new cutaway into Syria where Russia can take over dominance. Remember this, these Russian airstrikes, while they're having a pillaring impact on ISIS, they're not there to destroy ISIS. They want to move them out. And also, President Obama's positions in terms of the airstrikes and what he's been doing has been so weakened and such rhetoric that we really don't have a presence there. And what is happening is the Free Syrian Army that the United States has been arming and getting ready to fight these battles are being taken out and pushed back by the Russians. So Russia is really challenging not only America's power and dominance, but Russia is asserting itself for a longer battle in the future.
Well, Ambassador Ivo Daalder is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and in 2009, President Obama nominated him as US ambassador to NATO. Ambassador, this proxy war is going to have lasting effects. There's an end game being sought here by the two superpowers.
Well, I'm not sure yet that it is a proxy war. I think we have two combatants with very different intentions. The United States is engaged in Syria, focused principally, in fact, only on ISIS, which is the most direct threat not only to the United States, but also to our European allies. And the Russians are there principally to support Assad. And to make sure that Assad does not get removed from the power base that he currently has, which is only about 20% of the country in terms of territory. I am worried, however, by the fact that you do have now U.S. and Russian airplanes in the same airspace, and until very recently, and in fact until today, doing so without any coordination, without any attempt to deconflict. My understanding is now that the Secretary of Defense has announced that they are very close with the Russians to find a way to set up a set of rules to try to avoid the possibility of accidents. Whether the Russians would abide by those rules, given the way they have acted really since last February when they invaded and annexed Crimea, is an open question. They have behaved in ways that are truly irresponsible and dangerous.
But it's more complicated than you suggest, isn't it? Because we've got some British warplanes out there, we've got the French out there. Turkey is prepared to defend its ground and its airspace as well. So we need some kind of coordinated effort. How about NATO? That's a worthwhile organisation. Why doesn't it sort this thing out?
Well, there is a coordinated effort. The U.S. is coordinating all the coalition bombing campaigns, and the French and the Brits and the Turks are all coordinating their strikes when it comes to the airspace of either Syria or Iraq. When it comes to Turkish airspace, that is, of course, the responsibility not only of Turkey, but of NATO. And NATO made very clear last week that if the Russians were to come into that airspace, there would be consequences. And we haven't seen an incursion there since. The problem is the Russians. They have inserted themselves. They're in the airspace. They're flying without letting people know where they're flying and when they're flying. And that is a recipe for disaster.
Let me bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong at this time. Jeffrey, the worry would be, so we've got this kind of semi-chaotic set of circumstances and engagements going on there, but not every one of the protagonists want the same thing. I mean, America wanted the end of Assad at one time. Now they say they're going just after ISIS.
That's what the problem is. There is no end game. There's no real plan to do anything because the Russians have just upset the balance of power there. And I mean, I would like to ask the ambassador, although I don't advocate it, what would happen if America and the allies simply said, okay, Mr. Putin, you want it, you got it, and they pulled out and let him have the whole shebang? What would happen? I mean, what would the consequence of that be, of just pulling out and saying goodbye?
Well, I think the consequence would be that Russia would own the conflict. That is the danger of them inserting themselves. And they would own the conflict and own the consequences. And the reality is that their military capacity now in country and whatever they could bring in is not going to be sufficient to solve this conflict. It may be sufficient to keep Assad in power in the places that he is now, but it is not going to be sufficient to deal with ISIS. It's not going to be sufficient to defeat the opposition, which of course is a majority. This is a majority Sunni country in Syria. It's not going to be sufficient to get rid of the Kurds or the Turks or anyone else. So it would become a Russian quagmire. But that's no good for anybody, given the refugees that we have and the circumstances that we have and the growth of ISIS.
And in any case, Armstrong, would America really want to hand over Syria to become an outpost of Russia?
You know, listen, it's not going to happen. I think what the ambassador is saying is critical, but there's much more that he should say. What Russia is doing is adjusting the battle space in Syria. What Russia's ultimate agenda is to destabilize Iraq and ultimately stabilize the Kurds. If you destabilize the Kurds, which is the most stable and most structure of any of the forces there, then you have the opening that you're looking for, especially if you can push ISIS into places like Erbil.
Do you not think that at the end of this, however long it's going to take, another 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, we're going to be ending up redrawing boundaries here? I mean, a country of Kurdistan may well exist. ISIS may well exist. Syria may be half the size it is today.
Yeah, I think the likelihood is that the borders that were drawn by a British and French diplomat in 1918 after the end of World War I, that those borders it's well possible are not going to be existing. I mean, de facto today, we already have different borders in the sense that Syrian government forces only control about 20% of their territory, which means they don't control 80% of the territory. ISIS is now controlling territory that is partly in Syria and partly in Iraq. The Kurds have, frankly, since 2003, controlled much of northern Iraq, and of course they have also control in parts of Syria and have an influence, though not control, in parts of Turkey. Just to on the point that Armstrong raised with regard to Russia's intention, there is a big gap between whatever intention it may have and the capacity that it has to affect this. We're talking about 35 aircraft that are now in country, of which no more than 4 or 5 are actually flying bombing sorties. They can only do it at night, during the day, because they don't have the capacity to do it at night. They are not bombing ISIS. They haven't done so up to this point because what they're interested in is to protect Assad. I don't see the Russians by themselves, whether we oppose them or not, being able to destabilize Iraq, being able to make sure to destabilize the Kurdish part of Iraq. I don't think they have the capability. They may have the intention, but they certainly don't have the capability.
So,
they're
Jeffrey,
not 10 feet tall.
If this is right, and we're slowly redrawing a map here, do we ask America, or do the United Nations and the Europeans, perhaps NATO, then pour resources into Turkey? Because that's going to be the new frontline defense for an expanded Russian influence.
Well, here we go. You know, go back to the 60s and what was called the domino theory. And the reason we were in South Vietnam was to protect, among others, Thailand and eventually India. And this whole domino theory was absolutely false. It just wasn't going to happen. And I get the same feeling now that, you know, we have to stay because of the consequences of expansion of the Russian influence there and the redrawing of the borders. The more I think about it, except for the refugees, which is a real problem, the more I think about it, let's let Putin own it. Just pull out and say, there you go, Vladimir, you take over, you own it, and we'll pick up the pieces when you fail.
Is that a practical solution, Ambassador Daalder?
Well, the problem is the pieces, picking up the pieces after he fails. I think I agree with Jeffrey that if we tell him to own it, he will have to own it and he will fail. He's not able to redraw the borders by himself. He's just not strong enough politically and militarily in order to bring that about. But the pieces we're worried about are two. One is the refugees. And if you live in Europe, that is a big number. We're talking about 1.5 million refugees just coming across the European borders this year. And if this continues, many more afterwards. I mean, 11 million Syrians are displaced internally within Syria or are refugee already. That's half the population. That's 50%. More can come if there's further destabilization. And then secondly, you do have to worry about ISIS. You do have to worry about a large terrorist organization controlling territory from which they could, through recruiting Western, including American sympathizers, they could use as a launching pad for terrorist attacks in Europe and in the United States. So those are the pieces we are worried about. It's why we're there, and it is Russia's game that is complicating this, but the fundamentals are the same. We need to find a way to end this conflict so refugees don't come streaming into Europe, and we need to find a way to contain ISIS so they will not be a threat to our homeland. Well,
again, if we step back a little bit from the warfare and the awful death and killing that's going on over there, the worry would be the rump of Syria, Ambassador, may not function very well, because it's not just every strata of the population that's rushing into Europe. It's mostly the intelligentsia, isn't it? It's the skills, it's the doctors, the philosophers, the high value, if you like, employees are trying to get the hell out of there.
Well, those are the ones who have the money to get out there. There are also many young men. So you're talking about both the intelligentsia, the ones that are going to add value to an economy when it finally can start functioning again, and you're talking about the young workforce that is leaving Syria. So in the long term, this is something that is going to have real consequences, quite apart, as you say, from the killing, which having killed 250,000 people already, maimed presumably many more than that, having kids living for years in refugee camps without schooling, the long-term consequences of this conflict are going to be with us for a very long time. Just handing it over to Vladimir Putin doesn't solve that problem.
Ambassador Ivo Daalder, thank you for being with us today. A reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com/US. There's no way to be definitively victorious in a debate. You may win an argument, but then sometimes the public supports the underdog. Here's a thought. Was the biggest winner of the first Democrat debate Joe Biden, who didn't actually take part? Well, the former Clinton White House spokesman, Bob Weiner, is in Washington for us. Bob, good to see you. Thanks for being part of the programme today. So how did the other candidates who did show up do, in your view?
Good to be with you, Martin. I don't think Biden was left with any room, to be honest. I think Hillary did such a spectacular job, and Bernie was right there actually supporting Hillary and making the point that we're tired of hearing about your fill-in-the-blank emails and talking about the issues, that there was absolutely no reason for Biden to be there.
Hillary has been going on the downward slide. At least it appears that way to us this side of the Atlantic. Did she put the brakes on that slide?
Well, you're actually, to be honest, Martin, a little behind the curve. She has stabilized and moved a little bit back in front, and now she's, again, 20 points in front of Bernie. With Biden in the race, she's 15 points ahead of Bernie. She is dominating the field. And the reason is, for all of the Democrats, here it was a great night for American politics. Here you heard about jobs, you heard about education, you heard about stopping guns, instead of the Republican debates, which are stopping women, stopping immigrants, stopping education. It was an amazing positive agenda for the country last night, and it showed a stark night and day difference between the two parties.
Armstrong Williams, let's see if you agree. A stark night and day difference between the two parties.
I'm wondering which debate Bob Weiner watched last night. Certainly was a debate I watched. I don't know if you saw CNN and others this morning after the debate. Facebook posted all their viewers' thoughts about who won the debate. Ironic enough, Bernie Sanders had 75%, Mrs. Clinton 18%, and Webb and Chafee and O'Malley followed with about 6%. Now, let me just tell you this. Bernie Sanders and his conversations about Wall Street and the corruption of Wall Street, Jim Webb talking about the fact that it was wrong to sign this nuclear deal with Iraq, the fact that the NRA is willing to give Jim Webb an A rating and Bernie Sanders a D- rating, and the fact that Mrs. Clinton still can attack Bernie Sanders. There are some issues here where it comes to supporting corporate America, supporting your wealth clients that benefits to 1%. There are some issues that Bernie Sanders touched upon, and more as these debates go forward with the Democratic candidates, you'll begin to see either Mrs. Clinton numbers begin to down spiral, or she has to step up to the plate. For someone who has so much experience, who has served in so many capacities, she did not measure up to that level and that orb that people expected of her last night. Even though she debated, even though she would love to see the emails go away, yes, she would love to see that because she doesn't want any attention upon her. But if any of us were under a civil investigation and we were to say to the judge, oh, I just erased all my emails from my computer, let me just tell you something. That would not sit well in the courtroom. This is far from over, and I don't know why Bob and anyone else would try to engage in the rhetoric of trying to crown Mrs. Clinton, because there was much divisiveness among the Democrats last night.
Jeffrey, which debate did you watch?
I watched the one that Bob watched. I mean, Armstrong's remarks come from a man who thinks that Ben Carson's a real candidate. I mean, it was ridiculous, completely written it off. I agree with Bob. There's no room left at the end for Joe Biden. I watched Bernie Sanders, and he definitely solidified the Bernie Sanders base. They loved him, and they will always love him. But he reminds me of an angry old man in an airport who just missed his airplane. Hillary came across really well because she's very good at it. And what I saw last night, there were 2 seat fillers on the end. But what I saw last night was President Clinton and Vice President O'Malley.
What about the NRA issue, Bob Weiner? That is very topical, of course. It's likely to, the way the statistics go, it's going to come up again and again, does it, as this next year rolls round? Is Hillary wise to take on the NRA like that?
Not only brilliant politically, but necessary substantively. And I brought for visuals for our viewers the Constitution of the United States. You know, it takes 1 hour to read, and you'll know more than the Supreme Court justices if you do. Amendment, the Second Amendment, which everybody refers to, it doesn't say you have the right to bear arms willy-nilly, you can all get guns. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Where's the militia that the Supreme Court bought and sold by the NRA, the Congress bought and sold by the NRA? Where's the National Guard or the police or whatever the militia would be? It doesn't mean you can have assault weapons. So Hillary was exactly right, by the way, taking Bernie on and saying that he voted 5 times against the Brady bill, which banned, and Clinton successfully banned, these assault weapons, these machine gun repeaters, and 2 million weapons were stopped because of the Brady bill, which Congress chickened out and didn't renew after Clinton was out of office. That is a necessary action. And by the way, Armstrong, I respect the fact that you're with Ben Carson. He's now within 1 point of Trump in the latest national poll. And Ben Carson and Armstrong and I were at the National Press Club last week. I'm a member of the National Press Club. And I watched Carson's speech. He is very effective. He is the soft-spoken Trump. But he represents take away the safety net. Even though he says my mother had the safety net, which helped her jobs, which helped him through college and grad school. But he says take away the safety net. Ben Carson is the quiet Trump, and he's very dangerous.
Okay, Armstrong, we just need to clarify. I know we say it every week, but you are a colleague and a supporter of Ben Carson. But just could you address for us from that perspective this NRA issue? Is it going to dominate the debate, do you think?
May I say this? I didn't think it was necessary today for me to give full disclosure because I thought we were talking about Hillary Clinton in the Democratic debate. I don't even know how Dr. Carson's name came in this, but since they feel so, well, Jeffrey thinks he can dismiss Dr. Carson. At least Bob takes him serious. Listen, the gun debate is a very critical debate. It is a debate, and Bob is absolutely right. There are some very treacherous terrains that you have to navigate with it. Listen, many Democrats support the NRA because many of them are in rural America. And as Mr. Sanders pointed out last night, there's a huge difference if you live in rural America and you live in inner city America. The game is very different. Now, you may call it whatever you want to. I don't think former Secretary of State Clinton can win with that hand coming out so strongly against gun manufacturers and coming out against these different types of issues. I think somewhere along the way, before the primaries start, she's got to find a way to soften the blows on it because she just cannot win. It is an issue that Americans care about, and I think Bob has another good point. There is such a huge difference between my candidate, Dr. Ben Carson, and Hillary Clinton. But guess what? It is one of the reasons why he continued to gain in the polls and gain on Mr. Trump.
Jeffrey, can we widen the discussion a second about Hillary's broader experience? Nobody doubts the fact she's been around the block many times. She's got gallons and gallons of experience. But listen, it's focused, of course, on the foreign policy area. And yes, while her husband was in office, she worked a lot in women's healthcare issues. But has she really worked the bruising political discussions on internal American politics to the extent that she'll be well prepared to be president?
She was a senator. What do you think that's all about? That's getting into the ring and exchanging left hooks and uppercuts. Yeah, she's battle tested. She actually does know what she's talking about. And you saw that last night in the debate. There was real substance, as opposed to the clown car circus that the Republican debates have become. I mean, they're a joke, and this was real substance.
Bob, I think you'll take that Jeffrey's a bit of a fan for Hillary. He has been, to be fair to him, he's been saying the same thing for a year now.
I'm a fan, too. I worked with Hillary in the White House for 6 years. But let me just point a fact here on what Armstrong has said. There is a 90% support base for increasing background checks. The NRA has blocked it by the extremes in their group, not even the full membership of their group, which supports background checks, expanded. So there is a base for taking concrete action on guns. And in terms of Hillary's broader issues, she has given major addresses on substance abuse, on gay marriage, on legal rights, on voting rights. She knows those issues cold, and on infrastructure jobs. So there is a broad agenda that Hillary Clinton represents and supports, in addition to the fact that you remember that she laid her claim to national fame on women's issues when she went to the China World Women's Conference 20 years ago and said that women's rights are human rights. She did something very courageous that the Chinese did not want her to do, and it has stuck ever since. And as Secretary of State, she went all around the world protecting women's education, girls' education, and women's rights. So, and in addition to opening up Burma with Aung San Suu Kyi, in addition to having the biggest crowds ever in Latin America, I mean, when Trump says Hillary was the worst Secretary of State ever, it's just babble, because before he said that for political purposes, he was saying she was a great Secretary of State and a great senator.
Armstrong, have the right just got the email issue to go banging on about for the next year?
Listen, the email issue is an issue in terms of transparency, in terms of honesty and credibility. Mrs. Clinton totally controls that issue. If she's just willing to come full circle, admit the mistakes that she made and the bad judgment, she can shut that down and move forward. It's actually interesting what Bob Weiner just said. There's nothing that he said in terms of her accomplishments, in terms of her leadership, in terms of her substance that I disagree with. I think what Bob and Jeffrey should be concerned about, and it just doesn't apply to the GOP candidates, is that the 2016 elections will be about an outsider and not the establishment candidate. And Mrs. Clinton is more representative of the establishment candidate than any of the candidates that are running today. And I believe that when it's all said and done, whomever represents the Democrats and whomever represents the Republicans, it will not be an establishment candidate. I think the voters on both sides have shown they do not want establishment candidates. They want outsiders. And I think that's what Mrs. Clinton and others like Mr. Bush must fight against that tide.
Well, Bob Weiner, let me ask you, do you think it's possible that even at this stage, a complete outsider, a fresh face on the Democratic side of the argument could emerge?
Well, how inside is how many of you can name any other woman who's been president ever of the United States? That is a major issue that Hillary has, and she says that's the ultimate outsider, is a woman knocking down that glass ceiling. And in terms of the email issue, there's so much babble about this. Condi Rice and Colin Powell erased their emails and were asked by the National Archives and the State Department to send in their emails. They wouldn't and didn't do it in the build-up to the Iraq War and the build-up to torture. Hillary sent hers in, and the Washington Post did a whole story, and I brought that as a visual. State Department first contacted Clinton about emails in summer of 2014. You go through the whole thing. Only the very last sentence of the entire article says, and I quote, "Officials have said Clinton is not a target of the inquiry." So there is no there. And that's what Bernie is saying, and the American people want to hear about education, jobs, health care, and tax breaks for the middle class. They don't want to hear about emails and the rest of the Republican agenda of saying no to immigrants and to women.
Bob Weiner, we thank you for your time. Jeffrey, Armstrong, good to have you with us. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku and Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.